ladies and gentlemen on the dais, distinguished ladies and gentlemen who have worked and present the social and the cultural organizations in this area, in Chittaranjan Park and Chittaranjan Kali Mandir. It is a great pleasure and honor for me to be here with you, and I would like to thank all of you very, very heartily for the welcome that you have given me. The welcome, of course, I receive as a stand-in for my father. It is very moving always to notice how after decades and decades of his not having participated in his country's political and social and cultural life actively, that there are so many who remember him, who honor him, who cherish him. And it's particularly moving for me that it's not only the youthful elderly people here who do that, but it's also the younger ones. I'm very happy that even children come along, wear the INA cap, and are taught to remember him, are taught about the independence struggle, and maybe that gives the young an idea that some of the things that we take for granted should not be taken for granted, that many of the things that we take as natural, that India is an independent sovereign state, is something that many men and women fought for valiantly. Some even had to give their lives in order for this to come true. You are here in a community which I think for the greatest part is composed of Bengalis. But you're here in another part of India, not in your, so to say, homeland Bengal, but in your homeland India. And I think this very much is an expression of what India is all about. India is a country of very diverse ethnic groups, of different languages, different subcultures, different religions, and yet India, I think, has managed to maintain a unity. And even though we all know that this is not always easy, and some 20, 30 years ago there was great concern that India might sort of not fall apart, but still sort of drift apart into different regional ethnic groups. One expression of this development, of course, was the emergence of some regional parties all over the country. But I think it was a great achievement that India coped with that. And maybe one of the greatest achievements of democracy was that when a government that had been in power for many decades was defeated, this defeat was accepted, and the party that had been in power went into opposition. I mean, that is the gist of a democratic country, that changes in power do not occur by assassination and murder, but occur through the vote of people. And after all, a democracy also lives on the fact that there is a strong party or group of parties in power, but there is also a strong group of parties in opposition that sort of keep the parties in power on their toes, and that sort of stand in line as a possible future government. And I think this is a very important development, because if it does not happen, I think people sort of in power become too complacent. Maybe they give too little attention to what their fellow men and women want, and give too little attention also to the question of where the country is supposed to go, because a stagnant country is also not a very healthy country. And of course, as coming from Bengal, you have a special admiration and love for my father. You have this love for him as a Bengali in part, maybe because he also incorporates many of the virtues, many of the characteristics that Bengal as a whole has. And I think maybe this is something I'm speculating about, and maybe you can tell me better, that his respect for other religions, even though he was a devout Hindu himself, he was a devout disciple of Swami Vivekananda. When important decisions were to be taken, he used to take a pilgrimage when he could and was not home, interned or in prison, to the Kali temple in Dakshineshwar. And our whole family has been attached to that, and I too try to go to Dakshineshwar every time I come. This time I didn't manage to go there. He was a devout Hindu, and yet he had great respect for other religions. He had great respect also in a very practical sense, that he advocated that in the INA, for example, the soldiers belonging to different religious groups, and there were of course Hindus, Muslims, Sikhs and other groups, smaller groups, that they would sort of share their meals, unlike the British Indian Army, where the different religious groups were kept apart. We probably would exaggerate if we say that the divisive forces which ultimately led to the partition were only forced on India. It certainly was not the case. There were sufficient divisive forces that clamored for this partition, and I think all of you know that Netaji was one of the leaders. Gandhiji, of course, was the other, who strongly opposed partition. And even though the 15th of August 1947 was a very happy day because the subcontinent became independent, though in 2 states at the time, it was also a very sad period because we also had to observe that a tremendous amount of cruelty, atrocities took place between different Indians. It was not the foreign power killing people, but it was Indians killing Indians, and this was pretty awful. And if my father had been around, I don't know whether he could have prevented that, but maybe he and Gandhiji might have tempered the development in some way, or I would imagine that particularly since my father living in a part of India which was not predominantly Muslim, but predominantly not predominantly Hindu, but predominantly Muslim, I think had better relationships with the Muslim leaders, and I think the Muslim leaders respected him more than probably any of the other, well, Hindu leaders, if you would call my father a Hindu leader. He was an Indian leader who happened to be a Hindu, no doubt, but in his identity he went beyond being a Hindu leader. But this respect maybe would at least have helped to improve the relationships between India and Pakistan, and maybe would have helped to save both countries several wars and an awful amount of investment in armament rather than in educational services and in social services, which I think the normal man and woman benefits far more from. I mean, who has benefited from the nuclear bomb? We can only say luckily it wasn't used so far, and hopefully it will not ever be used on any neighbor, and hopefully no neighbor will ever use it on India. But if that could all have been spent on schools, hospitals and the like, I think both countries would be better off. And of course, the third country that emerged eventually, Bangladesh. You have moved out of Bengal, and you certainly in one way emphasize your Indian identity, but you also emphasize your Bengali identity by living or at least coming together in Chittaranjan Park, which is after all Little Bengal in Delhi. And the fact that you come here certainly is also a sign of that. Brigadier Chikara addressed several aspects of my father's life and what should be done with regard to his heritage. I would like to just shortly address the last one that he mentioned. Uh, is Netaji alive? And I would like to answer in that way. Netaji most certainly is alive, or you wouldn't be here. He is alive in the hearts of his countrymen. He's alive, hopefully, in the minds of his countrymen, if we can imbibe values and ideas of that generation of men and women who were willing to sacrifice for India in the young. Throughout the world, not only in India, I think people have become rather selfish and more self-centered. It's more greedy also. It's more what do I have, where do I benefit, maybe even where can I exploit others. And I think this kind of attitude is certainly not one that the active freedom fighters ever lived for. It is quite legitimate that everyone has selfish motives too. I mean, we have to make a living, we have to support a family, we have to give something to our children, to give them an education and upbringing. But I think this should not be done, particularly not if it is not necessary out of a dire need, by exploiting others, by cheating others, and by being essentially harmful to society as a whole. And I think in that sense, I think if Netaji lives, he can do a lot. And certainly it's the families, but it's also the schools that form and educate children. And India will have a tremendous challenge with a growing population, with a global player in the world, to contribute in a responsible way. And I think if all these aspects can be covered by all educators, from parents, from family, to schools, to universities, and at the same time we can look back on the positive traits of other generations past, then I think it certainly should benefit India as a whole. I thank you very much that you, by your presence, show that respect for my father, for that generation willing to sacrifice. And I hope that all of you will have the strength to give to your children, and the young people, of course, will have the strength to give to the next generation when they get older, a set of values which makes India a successful country worth to live in. Jai Hind.